The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Camilla Parker Bowles stood before the imposing iron gates. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her black leather handbag, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Behind her, a small group of family members waited in uncomfortable silence, their faces etched with worry and uncertainty. Camilla had always known that marrying into the royal family would bring challenges, but she never imagined it would come to this. The events of the past few weeks had unfolded like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. What started as whispered rumors in the palace corridors had escalated into a full-blown crisis that threatened to tear apart everything she held dear. The trouble began 3 months earlier when Camilla's younger brother, Mark, made headlines for all the wrong reasons. A gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control led him to make desperate choices, including attempting to sell private family photographs to tabloid newspapers. The photos themselves were harmless enough, childhood pictures of Camilla, family gatherings, and casual moments that any family might cherish. But, in the wrong hands, they became weapons that could damage the carefully maintained image of the royal family. Mark's actions sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Hartwell, was the first to bring the matter to the attention of the senior royals. In a tense meeting held in the oak-paneled study overlooking the palace gardens, he laid out the full extent of the potential damage. The photographs, if published, would not only embarrass Camilla but could also provide intimate glimpses into the private life of the future king and queen consort. King Charles, still adjusting to his new role following his mother's passing, found himself caught between his love for Camilla and his duty to protect the institution of the monarchy. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders as he listened to the advisors present their recommendations. The unanimous opinion was clear. Swift action needed to be taken to contain the situation before it spiraled further out of control. The palace's response was swift and merciless. Within days, new security protocols were implemented that effectively barred Camilla's immediate family from accessing the royal residences. The official explanation given to the press was vague, mentioning enhanced security measures and evolving protocols, but those within the palace walls understood the true meaning. Camilla's family had become a liability, and in the unforgiving world of royal politics, liabilities were quickly eliminated. Camilla felt the isolation almost immediately. Her weekly tea with her sister Annabelle was canceled without explanation. Her son Tom's planned visit to discuss his upcoming charity event was postponed indefinitely. Even her beloved grandchildren were suddenly unavailable for their usual weekend visits to the countryside estate. The invisible walls that surrounded her grew higher with each passing day, separating her from the people who had shaped her into the woman she had become. The emotional toll was devastating. Camilla had always prided herself on her resilience, her ability to weather the storms that came with public life. She had endured decades of negative press coverage, public criticism, and the constant scrutiny that came with being Charles's companion and later his wife. But this felt different. This wasn't criticism from strangers or tabloid headlines. This was rejection from within, a systematic dismantling of her support system by the very institution she had sworn to serve. Charles tried his best to support her during those dark weeks. He would find her in the gardens at Clarence House, staring out at the roses she had planted years earlier, her usually bright eyes clouded with sadness. Their conversations became strained as Camilla struggled to balance her loyalty to her family with her understanding of the palace's position. She knew that Mark's actions were inexcusable, but the idea of completely cutting ties with her loved ones felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in about family loyalty. The breaking point came when Camilla received word that her elderly mother, Rosalind, had been hospitalized following a fall at her home in East Sussex. The frail woman, now in her 90s, had been asking for her daughter, confused and frightened by the unfamiliar hospital surroundings. Camilla's immediate instinct was to rush to her mother's side, but the palace protocol officers informed her that any public appearance at the hospital could draw unwanted media attention to the ongoing family situation. For the first time in years, Camilla felt truly trapped by her royal status. The gilded cage that she had grown accustomed to over the years suddenly felt suffocating. She paced the floors of her private apartments, her mind racing with thoughts of her mother lying alone in a hospital bed while she remained hidden away behind palace walls. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for the right to be part of the royal family, and now that very membership was preventing her from being with her own family when they needed her most. The decision to defy palace protocol didn't come easily. Camilla spent a sleepless night weighing her options, staring out at the London skyline from her bedroom window. She thought about her late mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth II, and the sacrifices that woman had made for duty and country. She thought about Diana, and the price that had been paid for putting personal desires above royal responsibilities. But, most of all, she thought about her mother, alone and scared, reaching out for a daughter who couldn't come to her. When dawn broke over London, Camilla's mind was made up. She would go to her mother, regardless of the consequences. She dressed carefully in a simple navy dress, applied her makeup with the practiced skill of someone who had spent years in the public eye, and prepared to face whatever storm awaited her. She called her driver and asked him to prepare the car, but was informed that her usual security detail had been reassigned. The message was clear: the palace would not facilitate what they considered to be a breach of protocol. Undeterred, Camilla called her personal assistant and asked her to arrange alternative transportation. Within an hour, a modest sedan arrived at the side entrance of Clarence's house. As Camilla made her way toward the car, she was intercepted by Sir Edward Heartfelt himself, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. He reminded her of the potential consequences of her actions, the damage it could cause to the monarchy's reputation, and the precedent it would set for future security protocols. But Camilla's resolve remained unshaken. With quiet dignity, she thanked Sir Edward for his concern but made it clear that she would not abandon her mother in her time of need. As she settled into the back seat of the car, she caught a glimpse of Charles watching from an upper window of the palace. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw in his expression the same conflict that was tearing at her own heart, the eternal struggle between personal desires and royal duty. The journey to East Sussex felt longer than usual, each mile taking her further from the protective bubble of royal security and closer to the uncertain world beyond palace walls. Camilla used the time to call her sister Annabelle, who had been maintaining a vigil at their mother's bedside. The conversation was emotional, filled with tears, and whispered apologies for the weeks of enforced separation. Annabelle assured her that their mother was stable but weak, and that the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. As the car pulled into the hospital car park, Camilla noticed the small crowd of photographers who had somehow learned of her impending arrival. The sight of the cameras reminded her of the early days with Charles, when every public appearance became a media circus. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to face the world outside the protective embrace of royal protocol. The hospital corridors were a stark contrast to the ornate hallways of the palace. Here, there was no gilding, no priceless artwork, no centuries of history embedded in every stone. Instead, there was the unmistakable smell of disinfectant, the soft sounds of medical equipment, and the quiet conversations of families dealing with their own crises. For Camilla, it felt like stepping back into a world she had almost forgotten, a world where titles and protocol mattered less than human compassion and family bonds. Her mother's room was on the third floor, overlooking a small garden where patients and visitors could find moments of peace away from the clinical atmosphere of the wards. As Camilla approached the door, she could hear Annabelle's gentle voice reading from a favorite novel their mother had enjoyed for decades. The familiar words brought back memories of childhood evenings when their mother would read to them, her voice creating magical worlds that transported them far from their everyday concerns. When Camilla entered the room, her mother's eyes lit up with a recognition that had been absent for weeks. Despite the tubes and monitors that surrounded her, Rosalind managed a weak smile and reached out her hand toward her daughter. The touch was electric, a connection that transcended the political machinations and security protocols that had kept them apart. In that moment, Camilla realized that some bonds were too strong to be broken by royal decree or palace politics. The reunion was bittersweet. Mother and daughter spoke in quiet tones, sharing memories and expressing love that had been bottled up during their enforced separation. Rosalind, despite her weakened state, seemed to understand the pressure her daughter was under. She spoke about the importance of family loyalty, but also acknowledged the unique position Camilla occupied as a member of the royal family. Her wisdom, earned through 9 decades of life experience, provided comfort and perspective that Camilla desperately needed. As the afternoon wore on, Camilla became aware that her presence at the hospital was becoming more widely known. Nurses and staff members began to whisper as they passed the room, and she could see the occasional flash of cameras from the car park below. She knew that her decision to defy palace protocol would have consequences, but, sitting beside her mother's bed, she felt more at peace than she had in weeks. The first sign of official displeasure came in the form of a text message from Sir Edward's office, requesting her immediate return to London for an urgent meeting. Camilla read the message and quietly deleted it, choosing instead to focus on her mother's needs. She helped Annabelle arrange for additional nursing care, spoke with the doctors about the treatment plan, and made sure that all the practical arrangements were in place for her mother's recovery. As evening approached, Camilla knew she couldn't postpone her return to London indefinitely. The longer she stayed away, the more difficult it would become to repair the damage her defiance had caused. She said goodbye to her mother with promises to return as soon as possible, knowing that such promises might be difficult to keep given the circumstances. The journey back to London was filled with anxiety and uncertainty. Camilla's mobile phone buzzed constantly with messages from various palace officials, but she chose not to read them during the drive. Instead, she watched the countryside pass by and tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever consequences awaited her. She thought about the irony of her situation. She had spent years fighting to be accepted as a legitimate member of the royal family, only to find herself now fighting for the right to maintain connections with her original family. When the car finally pulled up to the gates of Buckingham Palace, Camilla was surprised to see the increased security presence. Additional guards were stationed at key points around the perimeter, and she noticed several unmarked vehicles that she didn't recognize. As her car approached the main entrance, one of the senior guards stepped forward and, politely but firmly, indicated that she should stop. The conversation that followed would change everything. The guard, a man Camilla had known for years and had always greeted with warmth and courtesy, explained that new security protocols were now in effect. Due to recent developments regarding her family's situation, access to the royal residences would need to be reviewed and approved through proper channels. The words were delivered with professional courtesy, but their meaning was unmistakable. Camilla was being denied entry to what had become her home. Standing there in the gathering darkness, facing guards who had once treated her with respect and deference, Camilla felt the full weight of her impossible position. She was caught between two worlds, two sets of loyalties, two definitions of family. The palace gates that had once opened to welcome her now stood as barriers, symbols of an institution that demanded absolute loyalty, but offered conditional acceptance in return. The realization hit her like a physical blow. After years of criticism, scandal, and public scrutiny, she had finally found acceptance within the royal family. She had earned her place through patience, dedication, and unwavering support for Charles and his responsibilities. But now, through circumstances largely beyond her control, she found herself on the outside once again, standing before the very gates that had once symbolized her triumph over adversity. As photographers in the distance captured the moment, their camera flashes illuminating the scene like lightning in a storm, Camilla felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. The strong facade she had maintained throughout decades of public life suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Here, before the guards who had once shown her respect, in front of the palace that had become her sanctuary, she was forced to confront the reality that her position within the royal family was more fragile than she had ever imagined. The tears came without warning, breaking through years of practiced royal composure like water through a cracked dam. Camilla pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity as the emotions she had suppressed for weeks finally found their release. The senior guard, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, shifted nervously as he watched the woman who had once been welcomed with ceremony, now standing vulnerable and broken before the palace gates. Behind Camilla, the small group of family members who had accompanied her that evening watched in stunned silence. Her son Tom stepped forward instinctively, his protective instincts overriding the formal protocol that usually governed interactions around the palace. He placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, offering silent support as she struggled to regain her composure. The simple gesture spoke volumes about the bonds that connected them, bonds that no amount of royal protocol could completely sever. The scene unfolding at the palace gates was unprecedented in modern royal history. Never before had a senior member of the royal family been so publicly denied access to their residence, and the guards themselves seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. The head of security, a veteran who had served the monarchy for over 2 decades, spoke quietly into his radio, seeking guidance from his superiors who were undoubtedly watching the situation unfold from within the palace walls. Camilla's emotional breakdown was not just about being denied entry to the palace. It represented the culmination of months of increasing isolation, the gradual erosion of her support system, and the growing realization that her position within the royal family was far more precarious than she had believed. The tears that now streamed down her carefully made-up face carried the weight of years of struggle, sacrifice, and the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of acceptance in a world that had initially rejected her. The media presence that had gathered outside the palace began to realize the significance of what they were witnessing. Photographers adjusted their lenses, and reporters started making urgent phone calls to their editors, recognizing that they were documenting a moment that would likely define Camilla's relationship with the monarchy for years to come. The flashes from their cameras created an almost surreal atmosphere, turning the deeply personal moment into a public spectacle that would be analyzed and discussed for decades. Inside the palace, Charles paced the floors of his private study, torn between his role as king and his love for his wife. Reports of the situation at the gates reached him through multiple channels: his private secretary, the head of security, and his own observation from the windows overlooking the courtyard. Each update made the conflict between his personal desires and his royal responsibilities more acute. He understood the palace's position regarding the security concerns raised by Camilla's brother's actions, but watching his wife being turned away from what should have been her home felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about love and loyalty. The queen consort's emotional state was exacerbated by the knowledge that her actions earlier that day, visiting her hospitalized mother against palace advice, had contributed to the current crisis. She had chosen family over protocol, a decision that felt right in her heart, but had clearly been interpreted by the palace establishment as a sign of unreliability or defiance. The guilt of potentially damaging Charles's reign, combined with the pain of being separated from both her original family and her royal family, created an emotional perfect storm that manifested in the breakdown now witnessed by the world. As word of the situation spread through the palace, reactions among the staff and courtiers varied dramatically. Some viewed Camilla's exclusion as a necessary measure to protect the monarchy's reputation and security. They argued that tough decisions were required to maintain the institution's integrity, and that personal considerations could not be allowed to compromise the crown's stability. Others, particularly those who had worked closely with Camilla over the years, felt deeply uncomfortable with the harsh treatment being meted out to someone who had proven her dedication to royal duties time and again. The timing of the crisis could hardly have been worse. Charles was still in the early months of his reign, working to establish his own vision for the monarchy while honoring his mother's legacy. The last thing he needed was a public relations disaster that called into question his judgment and his ability to manage both family and state affairs effectively. Yet here he was, forced to choose between supporting his wife and maintaining the confidence of the palace establishment that would be crucial to the success of his kingship. Camilla's sister Annabelle, who had driven directly from their mother's hospital bedside to offer support, approached the guards with a mixture of determination and desperation. She had watched her sister transform from a private individual into a public figure who handled criticism and scrutiny with remarkable grace. Seeing Camilla now, broken and vulnerable, reminded her of the young woman she had grown up with, someone who valued family above all else, and who had never sought the spotlight that had been thrust upon her. The conversation between Annabelle and the head of security was conducted in hushed tones, but the body language of both parties made it clear that no resolution was forthcoming. The guards had their orders, and despite any personal sympathy they might have felt for Camilla's situation, they were not authorized to make exceptions to the new security protocols. The rigid adherence to procedure, while understandable from a security perspective, felt cruel and heartless to those who were witnessing its human impact. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, emergency meetings were being convened to address the rapidly deteriorating situation. Sir Edward Heartfelt found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending decisions that he had recommended but that were now creating a public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions. The palace's communications team scrambled to develop a strategy for managing the media fallout, while legal advisors reviewed the implications of the security measures that had been implemented. The broader royal household was divided in their reactions to the unfolding drama. Younger members of the family, particularly those who had grown to appreciate Camilla's warmth and genuine care for the institution, felt that the punishment was disproportionate to the crime. They argued that Camilla should not be held responsible for her brother's poor decisions and that isolating her would only weaken the monarchy's public image. Older, more traditional voices within the establishment maintained that decisive action was necessary to prevent any perception of weakness or compromise in security matters. Public reaction to the images and reports emerging from the palace gates was swift and largely sympathetic to Camilla. Social media platforms filled with messages of support for the queen consort, with many commenters expressing outrage at what they perceived as cold and heartless treatment. The sight of a senior royal being denied access to her home, combined with reports of her hospitalized mother, created a narrative that painted the palace establishment as disconnected from basic human decency. The emotional toll on Charles became increasingly evident as the evening progressed. Palace staff reported that he had canceled his planned engagements for the following day and had spent hours in private consultation with his most trusted advisors. The king faced an impossible choice: overrule his security team and potentially compromise the monarchy's safety protocols, or support their decision and risk irreparable damage to his marriage and his wife's emotional well-being. As night fell over London, Camilla remained at the palace gates, her family forming a protective circle around her as she struggled to process the events of the day. The stark contrast between the grandeur of the palace and the human drama unfolding at its entrance served as a powerful metaphor for the eternal tension between institutional needs and personal relationships that had defined royal life for centuries. Tom, Camilla's son, finally convinced his mother to move away from the immediate vicinity of the gates, guiding her to a nearby bench where she could sit and collect herself away from the most intense media attention. The young man who had grown up in the shadow of royal scrutiny found himself thrust into the role of protector and advocate for his mother, a position he had never expected to occupy, but one he embraced with natural grace and determination. The palace's handling of the situation drew criticism not just for its harshness, but also for its apparent lack of strategic thinking. Royal commentators and constitutional experts began appearing on television programs, questioning whether the monarchy's response was proportionate to the threat posed by Mark's actions. Some pointed out that the royal family had weathered far more serious scandals in the past without resorting to such dramatic measures, suggesting that the current crisis might be more about internal palace politics than genuine security concerns. Charles's inner circle of advisors found themselves deeply divided on how to proceed. Those who prioritized the monarchy's long-term stability argued that showing strength in the face of security threats was essential, even if it meant temporary personal sacrifices. Others contended that the institution's reputation would suffer more from being seen as heartless and inflexible than from any potential embarrassment caused by Camilla's brother's actions. The queen consort's breakdown at the palace gates became a defining moment that crystallized public opinion about the modern monarchy's priorities and values. For many observers, the image of Camilla crying before the guards represented everything that was wrong with an institution that seemed to value protocol over compassion, security over humanity. The emotional rawness of the moment stripped away the carefully constructed public relations facade that typically surrounded royal activities, revealing the very real human cost of life within the monarchy. As the immediate crisis unfolded, longer-term questions began to emerge about the sustainability of the current approach to royal security and family management. Legal experts noted that the precedent being set could have far-reaching implications for how the monarchy handled future family-related security concerns. If Camilla could be excluded based on her brother's actions, what would prevent similar measures being taken against other royal family members whose relatives might create embarrassment or potential security risks? The international media picked up the story with particular interest, as many foreign publications had long been fascinated by Camilla's journey from controversial figure to respected queen consort. The dramatic reversal of fortune represented by her exclusion from the palace created a narrative that resonated far beyond the United Kingdom, touching on universal themes of family loyalty, institutional power, and the price of public service. Throughout the long evening hours, Camilla's supporters within the royal household worked behind the scenes to find a resolution to the crisis. Princess, and known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, reportedly made several phone calls to senior palace officials, arguing that the situation was becoming counterproductive and damaging to the monarchy's reputation. Her intervention, while discreet, added significant weight to the growing internal pressure for a more compassionate response. The breakdown at the palace gates also highlighted the unique position that Camilla occupied within the royal hierarchy. Unlike those born into the monarchy, she had to continuously prove her worth and loyalty, making her vulnerable to exactly the kind of crisis that was now unfolding. Her emotional response reflected not just immediate pain, but also the accumulated stress of years spent walking a tightrope between acceptance and rejection, always aware that her position was less secure than that of her blood relatives. As media coverage of the incident intensified, public support for Camilla grew stronger. Polling conducted in the hours following the Palace Gate incident showed a significant increase in her approval ratings, with many respondents expressing sympathy for her situation and criticism of the palace's handling of the matter. The very public nature of her emotional breakdown, far from damaging her reputation, seemed to humanize her in the eyes of many who had previously been indifferent to her role within the royal family. The crisis also exposed the complex web of relationships and loyalties that existed within the extended royal household. Staff members who had worked with Camilla for years found themselves torn between their professional obligations and their personal feelings about the treatment she was receiving. Many had witnessed firsthand her dedication to her royal duties and her genuine care for the people around her, making the current situation particularly difficult to accept. The night air grew colder as Camilla sat on the bench outside the palace grounds, her family maintaining a protective vigil around her. The emotional exhaustion of the day had drained much of her usual resilience, leaving her feeling more vulnerable than she had in decades. Her carefully styled hair had become disheveled during her breakdown, and her makeup had run with her tears, but these physical manifestations of distress seemed insignificant compared to the deeper wounds that had been opened by the events of the past few hours. Tom remained beside his mother, occasionally offering quiet words of comfort, while keeping a watchful eye on the photographers who maintained their distance, but continued to document every moment of the unfolding drama. He had inherited his mother's strength and dignity, qualities that had served him well during the years when Camilla faced intense public scrutiny. Now, those same qualities enabled him to provide the steady support she desperately needed during her darkest hour. Inside the palace, Charles had finally reached a decision that would test both his authority as king and his commitment to his wife. After hours of agonizing deliberation and consultation with his most trusted advisors, he made the unprecedented choice to override his security team's recommendations. The decision did not come easily. It represented a direct challenge to the palace establishment that would have long-term consequences for his reign and his relationship with the traditional power structures that supported the monarchy. The king's private secretary received the order with barely concealed shock. Never in his decades of service had he witnessed a reigning monarch directly countermand security protocols in such a dramatic fashion. Charles's instructions were clear and unambiguous. Camilla was to be readmitted to the palace immediately, and arrangements were to be made for her family to have appropriate access while maintaining necessary security measures. The tone of the king's voice left no room for debate or further discussion. Sir Edward Hartwell found himself in the uncomfortable position of implementing a decision he had strongly advised against. His professional reputation and years of experience told him that the king was making a mistake that could have serious consequences for royal security and institutional credibility. However, his loyalty to the crown meant that he had no choice but to carry out the royal command, regardless of his personal misgivings about its wisdom. The message to stand down the security restrictions traveled quickly through the palace communication network. Guards who had been maintaining their positions at the gates received new instructions that directly contradicted their earlier orders. The head of security, a man accustomed to clear chains of command and unambiguous protocols, struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing situation while maintaining the professional demeanor expected of someone in his position. When the senior guard approached the bench where Camilla sat with her family, his expression had changed from the formal coldness of earlier to something approaching embarrassment. Years of military training had taught him to follow orders without question, but the current situation challenged his understanding of duty and compassion in ways he had never experienced. He cleared his throat nervously before delivering the message that would end the immediate crisis, but potentially create new problems for the future. Camilla looked up at the guard with eyes that still showed the evidence of her emotional breakdown. The relief that washed over her face when she heard that the security restrictions had been lifted was immediately tempered by the knowledge that this reprieve had come at a significant cost. She understood the implications of Charles's decision better than most. By overruling his security advisors, he had potentially weakened his position within the palace hierarchy and created precedents that could be used against him in future conflicts. The walk from the bench to the palace entrance felt like a journey through different worlds. With each step, Camilla transitioned from the public realm where she had been exposed and vulnerable back into the protected environment of royal privilege. The contrast was stark and unsettling, highlighting the artificial nature of the boundaries that separated her two lives. The gates that had seemed so imposing and final just hours earlier now swung open with mechanical efficiency, as if the previous drama had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Tom walked beside his mother as they approached the palace entrance, his presence providing both emotional support and a visible reminder of the family connections that had precipitated the crisis. The young man who had grown up understanding the delicate balance between public and private life found himself witnessing firsthand the fragility of the institutions that had shaped his upbringing. The experience would leave him with a deeper understanding of the sacrifices his mother had made and the precarious nature of royal acceptance. The palace staff who witnessed Camilla's return exhibited a range of reactions that reflected the divisions within the royal household regarding her treatment. Some appeared genuinely relieved to see her back, their faces showing the strain of the past few hours and their discomfort with the harsh measures that had been implemented. Others maintained the neutral expressions that professional training had taught them, but their body language suggested ongoing uncertainty about the precedent that was being set. Charles waited for Camilla in his private study, the same room where he had paced for hours while the drama unfolded at the palace gates. The reunion between husband and wife was emotional and complex, marked by relief, recrimination, and the shared understanding that their relationship had been tested in ways that would have lasting consequences. The king, who had stood by protocol and institutional needs for hours before ultimately choosing love over duty, found himself facing a wife who had been deeply wounded by the experience of abandonment. Their conversation, conducted away from the ears of staff and advisors, touched on fundamental questions about their marriage, their shared responsibilities, and the sustainability of their positions within the monarchy. Camilla's questions were pointed and painful. How could she trust an institution that had turned against her so quickly? And how could she continue to serve a crown that seemed to view her as expendable? Charles's responses revealed his own struggle with the competing demands of kingship and personal loyalty. The immediate aftermath of the crisis required careful management to prevent further damage to the monarchy's reputation and the relationships within the royal household. Palace communications staff worked through the night to develop a narrative that would explain the evening's events without admitting to the institutional failures that had precipitated them. The challenge was to maintain the fiction of royal unity while acknowledging that significant problems had occurred. Media coverage of Camilla's readmission to the palace was extensive but mixed in its interpretation. Some outlets portrayed Charles's decision as a demonstration of his commitment to family values and his willingness to challenge outdated protocols when they conflicted with basic human decency. Others viewed it as a sign of weakness, suggesting that the new king had allowed personal emotions to override the institutional requirements of effective monarchy. The public reaction to the resolution of the crisis was overwhelmingly positive, with social media platforms filled with expressions of support for both Camilla and Charles. Many commenters praised the king for prioritizing his wife's well-being over rigid protocol, while others used the incident to highlight broader concerns about the monarchy's treatment of those who married into the institution rather than being born to it. The emotional resonance of the story transcended traditional political and social divisions, touching people across different demographics. Behind the scenes, the palace establishment began to grapple with the longer-term implications of the evening's events. The precedent set by Charles's intervention would inevitably influence how future security decisions were made and implemented. Senior courtiers and advisors found themselves reconsidering established protocols and procedures, recognizing that the traditional approaches might not be sustainable in an era of intense media scrutiny and changing public expectations. The crisis also prompted a broader review of how the royal family handled relatives and family connections of those who married into the monarchy. Camilla's situation had exposed weaknesses in the existing systems for managing potential security risks while maintaining the human relationships that provided emotional support for senior royals. The challenge was to develop new approaches that balanced legitimate security concerns with the need to preserve family bonds. Sir Edward Heartfelt submitted his resignation the following morning, recognizing that his position had become untenable following his role in implementing the security measures that had led to such public embarrassment for the crown. His departure marked the end of a distinguished career in royal service, but also symbolized the institutional changes that would be necessary to prevent similar crises in the future. The king accepted the resignation with regret, but understanding, acknowledging the impossible position that his private secretary had been placed in. The process of rebuilding trust within the royal household began immediately, but progress was slow and difficult. Camilla's relationship with many of the senior courtiers who had supported her exclusion remained strained, creating an atmosphere of tension that affected the efficiency of palace operations. Staff members found themselves choosing sides in what became known as the Palace Civil War, with loyalty to different individuals and philosophies creating divisions that had not existed before the crisis. Charles used his authority to implement immediate changes to security protocols, ensuring that future decisions regarding family access would require his personal approval rather than being made at lower levels within the palace hierarchy. The new procedures were designed to prevent the kind of arbitrary exclusions that had precipitated the crisis, but they also represented a significant centralization of power that made some advisors uncomfortable. The impact of the crisis extended beyond the immediate royal household to affect relationships with other members of the extended royal family. Some relatives expressed private concerns about the precedent that had been set, worried that future family emergencies might be handled with similar harshness. Others supported Charles's decision to prioritize family loyalty, seeing it as evidence of the kind of modernization that the monarchy needed to remain relevant in contemporary society. Camilla's mother, Rosalind, still recovering in the hospital, became an unwitting symbol of the human costs associated with rigid institutional protocols. Her confusion about why her daughter had been absent during a critical period of her recovery highlighted the disconnect between palace policies and real-world consequences. The elderly woman's gradual understanding of the situation added another layer of complexity to an already challenging family dynamic. The international media coverage of the crisis provided valuable insights into how the British royal family was perceived abroad. Many foreign observers expressed surprise at the harshness of the initial response to what they viewed as a relatively minor security concern. The contrast between the public image of royal compassion and the reality of institutional coldness created narrative tensions that would influence international perceptions for years to come. Legal experts began to examine the constitutional implications of Charles's decision to override his security advisors. While the king clearly had the authority to make such decisions, the manner in which it was exercised raised questions about the balance of power within the royal household and the role of professional advisors in guiding royal decision-making. Some constitutional scholars argued that the precedent could strengthen royal authority, while others worried about the potential for arbitrary decision-making. The crisis also highlighted the unique challenges faced by those who marry into the royal family later in life, particularly when they bring complex family relationships and histories with them. Unlike those born into royal life, Camilla had to navigate the competing demands of old loyalties and new responsibilities, often without clear guidance about how to balance these conflicting obligations. Her breakdown at the palace gates became a symbol of the impossible position that such individuals often found themselves in. As the immediate drama subsided, attention turned to the longer-term consequences for Camilla's role within the monarchy. The crisis had demonstrated both her vulnerability and her resilience, qualities that would influence how she approached her duties as queen consort in the months and years ahead. The emotional scars from the experience would take time to heal, but they also provided her with a deeper understanding of the true nature of royal power and its limitations. The staff changes that followed the crisis extended beyond Sir Edward's resignation to include several other senior positions within the palace hierarchy. Charles used the opportunity to bring in advisors who better understood his vision for a more compassionate and flexible monarchy, but these appointments also created new tensions with traditional elements within the establishment who viewed the changes as dangerous precedents that weakened institutional authority. The weeks following the Palace Gate incident transformed into a period of careful rebuilding and strategic repositioning for both Camilla and the monarchy as a whole. The queen consort threw herself into her royal duties with renewed determination, understanding that her future security within the institution would depend on demonstrating her irreplaceable value to the crown. Her public appearances took on a different quality, marked by increased warmth and accessibility that resonated powerfully with audiences who had witnessed her vulnerability during the crisis. Charles observed his wife's evolution with a mixture of pride and concern. The woman who had always been strong and resilient had developed an additional layer of steel following her ordeal, but he worried about the emotional cost of the armor she was constructing around herself. Their private conversations revealed the depth of the changes occurring within Camilla's psyche as she adapted to the new reality of her position within the royal hierarchy. The first major test of the new dynamic came when Camilla was scheduled to undertake a solo overseas visit to Australia, a tour that had been planned months in advance, but which now carried additional symbolic weight. Palace advisors debated whether the timing was appropriate, given the recent controversy, but Charles insisted that the visit proceed as scheduled. He recognized that demonstrating confidence in Camilla's abilities was crucial to rebuilding both institutional and public trust in her role. Preparation for the Australian tour revealed the ongoing tensions within the palace establishment. Some members of Camilla's advance team expressed private concerns about potential protests or negative reactions from Australian media, who had historically been critical of her relationship with Charles. Others argued that the recent crisis had actually generated sympathy for Camilla that could be leveraged to improve her international standing. The competing perspectives highlighted the uncertainty that continued to surround her position. The Australian visit itself proved to be a revelation. Camilla's appearances drew larger and more enthusiastic crowds than had been anticipated, with many attendees specifically expressing support for her during the recent difficulties. The Queen Consort's genuine emotional responses to the warmth of her reception created powerful moments that were captured by international media and transmitted around the world. Her ability to connect with people on a human level, enhanced rather than diminished by her recent vulnerability, proved to be one of her greatest assets. Meanwhile, back in London, the investigation into Mark's financial dealings and his attempted sale of family photographs continued to unfold. New details emerged about the extent of his gambling debts and the sophisticated nature of the approaches made to him by individuals seeking compromising information about the royal family. The revelations vindicated some of the palace's initial security concerns while also highlighting the inadequacy of their response to the human dimensions of the crisis. Camilla's relationship with her brother became one of the most challenging aspects of the ongoing situation. Mark's actions had precipitated the crisis that led to her exclusion from the palace. But she struggled with the idea of completely severing ties with someone who had been part of her life long before she entered the royal sphere. The balance between family loyalty and institutional protection remained a constant source of tension and moral complexity. The process of developing new security protocols that could accommodate family relationships while protecting royal interests proved to be more complex than initially anticipated. Legal experts, security professionals, and constitutional scholars worked together to create frameworks that could prevent future crises without imposing the kind of arbitrary restrictions that had caused so much damage. The challenge was to develop systems that were both effective and humane. Public opinion polling conducted several months after the crisis revealed interesting shifts in attitudes toward the monarchy and Camilla specifically. Her approval ratings had actually increased significantly following the Palace Gate incident, with many respondents indicating that they viewed her more favorably after seeing her display genuine emotion and vulnerability. The human dimension of her experience had created connections with the public that years of carefully managed royal appearances had failed to achieve. The impact on Charles's reign was more complex and multifaceted. While some constitutional experts criticized his decision to override security protocols, others praised his willingness to prioritize family relationships and human decency over rigid institutional requirements. The precedent he had set would influence how future monarchs approached similar conflicts between personal and institutional obligations. His approval ratings remained stable, suggesting that the public supported his choice to stand by his wife during her time of need. The resignation of Sir Edward Heartfelt and other senior palace officials created opportunities for institutional reform that Charles had been seeking since his accession to the throne. The new appointments reflected his vision for a more modern and compassionate approach to monarchy, but they also generated resistance from traditional elements within the establishment who viewed the changes as potentially dangerous departures from proven methods of royal management. Camilla's mother Rosalind gradually recovered from her hospitalization, but the experience had deepened her understanding of the pressures her daughter faced as a member of the royal family. Her occasional public statements about the crisis were carefully crafted to avoid further controversy while expressing gratitude for the support her family had received during difficult times. The elderly woman's dignity and grace under pressure became an additional source of public sympathy for Camilla's situation. The international media coverage of the crisis and Its aftermath continued to generate discussion about the nature of modern monarchy and the treatment of those who marry into royal families. Comparisons were drawn with similar situations involving other European royal houses, highlighting both the unique aspects of the British system and the common challenges faced by monarchies in balancing tradition with contemporary values and expectations. Educational institutions began to incorporate the Palace Gate incident into curricula dealing with constitutional law, public administration, and crisis management. The case study provided valuable insights into the complex interactions between institutional requirements, personal relationships, and public opinion in modern democratic societies. Legal scholars debated the constitutional implications of Charles's intervention for years afterward. The physical and psychological security measures surrounding Camilla were quietly enhanced in ways that addressed legitimate concerns while avoiding the kind of dramatic restrictions that had precipitated the original crisis. New technologies and approaches allowed for more sophisticated monitoring and protection without requiring the complete isolation of potentially vulnerable family members. The innovations developed during this period influenced security practices throughout the royal household. Camilla's charitable work took on new dimensions as she channeled her experiences during the crisis into advocacy for families dealing with addiction, mental health issues, and financial difficulties. Her personal understanding of how family problems could cascade into broader crises gave her speeches and appearances an authenticity that resonated powerfully with audiences facing similar challenges. The transformation of personal pain into public service became one of the most positive outcomes of the difficult period. The relationship between Camilla and the media evolved significantly following the Palace Gate incident. Journalists who had been critical of her in the past began to reassess their coverage, recognizing that the institutional response to her family crisis had been disproportionate and harmful. Some media outlets published retrospective analyses of their own role in creating the pressures that had contributed to the crisis, leading to broader discussions about responsible royal reporting. Tom's role as an advocate and protector for his mother during the crisis elevated his profile within royal circles and led to increased responsibilities in supporting Camilla's work. The young man's grace under pressure and loyalty to his family impressed palace officials and members of the extended royal family, earning him respect that would serve him well in his future interactions with the institution. His presence at official events became more prominent as recognition grew of his stabilizing influence on his mother. The development of new protocols for handling family-related security issues involved extensive consultation with experts in psychology, social work, and family therapy. The goal was to create systems that recognized the importance of family relationships for individual well-being while maintaining necessary protections for the institution. The interdisciplinary approach represented a significant departure from traditional palace decision-making processes. Legal challenges to some of the security measures that had been implemented during the crisis emerged in various courts, raising complex questions about the extent of royal authority and the rights of individuals who found themselves affected by palace decisions. While most of these cases were ultimately unsuccessful, they contributed to a broader public discussion about the balance between institutional privilege and individual rights in a constitutional monarchy. The crisis had unexpected positive effects on relationships within the broader royal family, as other members rallied to support Camilla during her time of difficulty. Princess Anne's behind-the-scenes advocacy proved particularly valuable, while younger royals publicly expressed their admiration for how she had handled the pressure. These demonstrations of family solidarity helped to repair some of the damage caused by the initial institutional response. Academic researchers studying organizational behavior and crisis management identified the Palace Gate incident as a classic example of how institutional responses could escalate rather than resolve conflicts when human factors were inadequately considered. Business schools and public administration programs used the case to illustrate the importance of emotional intelligence and compassionate leadership in complex organizational environments. The long-term impact on palace culture was profound and lasting. Staff members at all levels became more attuned to the human consequences of institutional decisions, leading to changes in how policies were developed and implemented. Training programs for senior officials began to include components on emotional intelligence and family dynamics, recognizing that effective royal service required understanding of both protocol and human nature. Camilla's personal growth during this period was remarkable to observe. The woman who had always been strong developed new dimensions of resilience and wisdom that enhanced her effectiveness in her royal role. Her ability to speak authentically about challenges and difficulties made her an even more powerful advocate for the causes she championed. The crisis that had threatened to destroy her position ultimately strengthened her connection with the public and her value to the institution. The precedent set by Charles's intervention in the crisis influenced how subsequent family-related issues were handled, with greater emphasis placed on finding solutions that protected both institutional interests and family relationships. The new approach required more sophisticated analysis and consultation, but it also reduced the likelihood of the kind of dramatic confrontations that had characterized the Palace Gate incident. Financial compensation and support systems were quietly established for family members who might be affected by security-related restrictions, recognizing that institutional decisions could have significant economic and emotional consequences for individuals who had no direct role in royal life. These measures helped to address some of the inequities that had been highlighted by the crisis, while maintaining necessary protections for the Crown. 2 years after the Palace Gate incident, Camilla stood once again before the same iron gates where she had experienced her emotional breakdown. This time, however, she was accompanied by a delegation of international dignitaries attending a special reception to mark the anniversary of Charles's coronation. The contrast between her previous vulnerable state and her current position of confidence and authority served as a powerful reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change within the complex world of royal politics. The Queen Consort had used the intervening period to systematically rebuild and strengthen her position within the monarchy, transforming what could have been a career-ending crisis into an opportunity for growth and renewal. Her approach had been methodical and strategic, focusing on areas where she could demonstrate irreplaceable value, while carefully managing the relationships that had been damaged during the difficult period following her family crisis. The most significant development had been the establishment of the Royal Family Foundation, a new charitable organization that Camilla had conceived and developed to address the kinds of family-related challenges that had contributed to her brother Mark's difficulties. The foundation's work with gambling addiction, financial literacy, and family support services had garnered widespread praise and demonstrated Camilla's ability to transform personal experience into meaningful public service. Mark himself had undergone a remarkable transformation during the same period. With Camilla's support and guidance, he had entered a comprehensive rehabilitation program that addressed both his gambling addiction and the underlying psychological issues that had contributed to his destructive behavior. His recovery had been genuine and sustained, allowing for a gradual rebuilding of trust within the family, while maintaining appropriate boundaries regarding his access to sensitive information. The new security protocols developed following the crisis had proven both effective and humane, successfully balancing institutional protection needs with the maintenance of important family relationships. The collaborative approach that brought together security professionals, family therapists, and constitutional experts had created frameworks that were being studied and adopted by other royal households around the world. The innovative solutions had transformed what initially appeared to be an irreconcilable conflict into a model for progressive royal administration. Charles's decision to support his wife during her time of crisis had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened his position as king. Public opinion research consistently showed that his willingness to prioritize family loyalty over rigid protocol had increased respect for his judgment and his values. The precedent he had set encouraged other institutions to reconsider their own approaches to balancing organizational needs with human considerations. The staff changes implemented following Sir Edward Hartwell's resignation had brought new energy and perspectives to palace operations. The appointments of younger, more diverse advisors with backgrounds in psychology, social work, and modern communications had modernized the institution's approach to crisis management and family relations. Traditional courtiers had initially resisted these changes, but the improved outcomes had gradually convinced even skeptics of their value. Camilla's relationship with the media had evolved into one of mutual respect based on her demonstrated transparency and authenticity during challenging times. Journalists who had previously been critical began to appreciate her willingness to address difficult topics honestly rather than hiding behind traditional royal reserve. Her media strategy, developed with the help of modern communications experts, emphasized genuine human connection over carefully crafted public relations messaging. The international impact of the crisis and its resolution had been significant for the reputation of the British monarchy. Foreign observers had noted the institutional capacity for self-reflection and reform demonstrated by the royal family's response to legitimate criticism. The willingness to acknowledge mistakes and implement meaningful changes had enhanced rather than damaged the monarchy's standing among democratic institutions worldwide. Educational initiatives emerging from the crisis had created new academic disciplines focused on the intersection of constitutional monarchy, family dynamics, and public service. Universities around the world developed courses examining how traditional institutions could adapt to contemporary values without losing their essential character. The case study provided rich material for exploring questions of loyalty, duty, and human dignity in complex organizational contexts. The Royal Family Foundation's annual report highlighted remarkable achievements in its second year of operation. Programs addressing gambling addiction had helped thousands of individuals and families, while financial literacy initiatives had prevented many others from falling into the kind of debt-related difficulties that had precipitated the original crisis. Camilla's personal involvement in these programs, drawing from her family's own experiences, had given the work an authenticity and effectiveness that traditional royal charity work often lacked. Legal reforms inspired by the constitutional questions raised during the crisis had clarified the relationship between royal prerogative and individual rights in cases involving family members of senior royals. Parliamentary committees had examined the balance of powers and developed new frameworks for ensuring that institutional decisions affecting private individuals met appropriate standards of fairness and proportionality. These reforms had strengthened rather than weakened the constitutional monarchy by making it more accountable and transparent. The psychological support services quietly established for royal family members and their relatives had proven invaluable in preventing future crises before they could escalate. Professional counselors and family therapists were now available to help navigate the unique pressures and challenges associated with royal life, while confidential assistance programs addressed issues like addiction, financial difficulties, and mental health challenges before they could compromise security or institutional reputation. Camilla's personal growth during the challenging period had transformed her into one of the monarchy's most effective advocates and representatives. Her ability to speak authentically about overcoming adversity resonated powerfully with audiences facing their own difficulties, while her demonstrated resilience under pressure had earned respect across different segments of society. The vulnerabilities she had shown during the crisis had paradoxically strengthened her public image by making her more relatable and human. The technological innovations developed to enhance security while preserving family relationships had broader applications beyond the royal context. Advanced monitoring systems, communication protocols, and risk assessment tools created during this period were being adopted by other institutions needing to balance protection requirements with the maintenance of personal relationships. The solutions had commercial value that helped offset the costs of their development. International academic conferences examining the Palace Gate incident and its aftermath had become annual events, bringing together scholars, practitioners, and policymakers to discuss lessons learned and ongoing developments. The case had become a standard reference point for discussions about institutional adaptation, crisis management, and the evolution of traditional authority structures in democratic societies. The establishment of family liaison officers within the royal household had created new career paths for professionals with backgrounds in social work, psychology, and family counseling. These positions provided crucial support for family members while serving as early warning systems for potential problems that could affect institutional security or reputation. The innovation had been adopted by other royal houses and even some corporate and political organizations. Camilla's charitable work had expanded beyond the Royal Family Foundation to include advocacy for reform of media coverage practices, particularly regarding family members who had not chosen public roles. Her campaigns for responsible reporting and respect for privacy had influenced industry standards and regulatory frameworks, creating better protection for individuals caught up in public interest stories through family connections rather than personal actions. The economic impact of the reforms had been surprisingly positive for the monarchy's finances. The more transparent and accountable approach to family-related issues had increased public support for royal funding, while the innovative programs and foundations had attracted private donations and corporate sponsorship that supplemented traditional sources of revenue. The modern approach had proven both more ethical and more profitable than traditional methods. Regional and local governments had begun implementing similar frameworks for addressing family-related challenges within their own operations, recognizing that the principles developed during the royal crisis had broader applicability. Training programs based on the royal experience were being offered to public servants, corporate executives, and nonprofit leaders dealing with complex family dynamics in their organizations. The long-term relationship between Camilla and Charles had been strengthened rather than weakened by their shared experience of the crisis. The king's decision to support his wife during her time of need had deepened their partnership and created a foundation of mutual trust that enhanced their effectiveness as a royal team. Their public appearances together now carried an authenticity and emotional connection that had been less evident in their earlier years together. As Camilla reflected on the journey from that dark night at the palace gates to her current position of strength and influence, she recognized that the crisis had ultimately provided her with the opportunity to define her own legacy within the monarchy. Rather than being remembered as someone who married into the royal family, she would be known as someone who helped modernize and humanize the institution while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. The annual memorial service for those affected by gambling addiction, established as part of the Royal Family Foundation's work, had become one of the most moving and meaningful events in the royal calendar. Camilla's personal participation in these services, speaking openly about her family's experiences and the lessons learned, had created powerful moments of connection between the monarchy and ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. The transformation of the crisis into an opportunity for positive change had required vision, courage, and sustained effort from multiple stakeholders within and around the royal household. The success of these efforts had demonstrated that even centuries-old institutions could adapt and evolve when faced with fundamental challenges to their values and methods. The Palace Gate incident had become a turning point not just for Camilla personally, but for the modern British monarchy's approach to balancing tradition with contemporary needs. Looking toward the future, Camilla could see that the foundations laid during those difficult months would continue to influence the monarchy for generations to come. The precedents established for handling family crises, the support systems created for vulnerable individuals, and the collaborative approaches developed for complex institutional challenges would serve as resources for future challenges that could not yet be anticipated. Her legacy would be measured not just by her survival of the crisis, but by her transformation of it into lasting positive change for the institution she had sworn to serve.